Hello. So in a previous training, we talked about task analysis a little bit. So this training is going to be on chaining. So we talked about a task analysis being, breaking down a larger skill into several smaller skills. And chaining is a specific way to teach a task analysis. So there's several types. There's forward, backward, and total task presentation. They're honestly all like they sound. Backward chaining, what we're looking at is teaching the last step first. So basically we're teaching it in a chain backwards. There's a couple of ways that you can do this. Like I said, we're working on fading our prompts for that last step first. So in the example of, say, we're working on washing hands, we have, turn the water on, get them wet, get the soap, scrub them, rinse, turn the water off, and then we want to dry our hands. So in that task analysis, the last step is drying our hands. So we would focus on that first. The advantages to that are that we're fading prompts and then providing reinforcement for that very last step right away. So in that scenario, we would full physically prompt the whole thing, the whole task analysis, and then work on fading our prompts for drying hands. So now, our goal is, okay, now they're drying their hands independently, so now they're going to get a cool reinforcer directly following that independent response. So that's a really big advantage to that. Another simple advantage that, is natural, but their task is done when they're done with that last step. So that's another little motivation, and kids are more likely to pick up on that pretty quickly. Okay, I dried my hands, now I'm done with this task that I don't love. And that alone is a little bit reinforcing for some kids. So they're more motivated to do that last step independently because they're that much closer to being done with the task. So once they are independently drying their hands, we would then go to the step before and work on, okay, now they're turning the water off and drying their hands independently. So we would start to encourage independence for the turning the water off piece and start feeding our prompts there. And then naturally, they already know how to dry their hands independently, so they're doing that piece, and now it's in sequence, which is nice too. And then you kind of slowly work your way back the other way until the last part is turning the water on, which is step 1 of your task analysis. So that is the last step that you are going to fade your prompts with. Forward chaining is the opposite. So you start fading your prompts on that first step first. So in the example of washing your hands, we would start to have your child start to fade prompts on turning the water on first, because that's our first step of our hand washing task analysis. And then, so once they're, independently turning the water on, okay, now we're going to turn the water on and get their hands wet independently. So, opposite of backward chaining, you'll just work on, you start with the first task in the task analysis, and then you work your way towards the steps successively as they're in order. There's advantages of that too. Obviously, the fact that the steps are in order is nice, and you can just target them in the order that they are. It's typically easier to be able to target it that way. Disadvantages, contrary to backward chaining, are the lull in reinforcement. So with backward chaining, we talked about how you finish the independent part and you're done with the task and you get your access to your reinforcer more quickly. Whereas in this one, you're fading your prompts and maybe you independently turn the water on today, but now we got to hurry up and do the rest of the task analysis before you can actually get your reinforcer and before you're done with the task. So that's one of the disadvantages with that. But again, it kind of depends on what the skill is and also, what's motivating for your child. And then the last one is total task presentation. So this is where you're working on feeding all your prompts on all steps at the same time. So this is typically used for when a child already is demonstrating some independence with those skills. So say your child's already turning the water on, getting their hands wet, drying their hands, and turning the water off by themselves. They're already showing independence in a lot of areas, so that basically means you don't have to specifically target those when you're working on your chaining procedure because they're already independent in those areas. So basically, you would work on your feeding your prompts for all of those other steps that aren't independent yet. So maybe they're not independent on scrubbing their hands and getting soap. So those are things that you would prompt and then work on feeding your prompt specifically for those skills and then let the child do everything else independently. So like I said, those are for those skills that are kind of already have some independent steps already, and you're just focusing on some other ones. Typically, I wouldn't recommend doing this if everything is fully prompted right now, just because it's overwhelming for you to teach and it's overwhelming for the child to comprehend. Like choosing one step to fade their prompts with is typically more reinforcing for the child because they know what the expectation is and they're able to understand, like, okay, I just got to work on drying my hands by myself and the rest my mom's going to help me with. That's kind of more encouraging instead of like the overwhelming, like, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing independently, so I'm just going to not do anything independently. So you might see less success going that route. I kind of talked a little bit about when to use total task presentation, but in terms of using forward and backward chaining will depend on, like I said, the type of skill that it is. Like if you think about shoe tying, the last step, the pulling tight, is the hardest skill for kids. So with that scenario, I wouldn't teach backward chaining because with backward chaining, we're fading our prompts on the very last step first. So you're almost setting the child up for failure because they're not having any success with doing the easier parts independently. So I think that that's important to note that, the last step in the process is the most challenging. So if that's the case, I would typically start on forward chaining because we want to kind of build the child's confidence before they're getting to the difficult parts. And also looking at, so that's looking at what the task is, but also looking at where you feel your child is more likely to be independent. So if you feel like, all right, they're closer to turning the water on by themselves than they are to drying their hands, I would maybe start there. So I would do a forward chaining procedure because they're showing more independence in the first task than they are in the last task. So you can kind of use that to your advantage when you're teaching as well. So those are the three main types of chaining that you can utilize. Like I said, I would choose one that's most appropriate for you to teach and what's most appropriate for your child, and then go from there. And remember to use the task analysis procedures that you learned about already too, and that's breaking down the individual steps for each of those larger skills based on your skills that your child has. And you can do that by doing it yourself and writing down each step as you go, or by observing your child and kind of seeing what they're already doing and draft your task analysis around that. And that's it for chaining. Thank you, guys.